Chapter 24. "That's it! You just said it, Malou," Dan exclaimed. "Temptation has everything to do with these guys stealing the car." "How do you mean?" "Don't you see? If I was tempted to eat bacon and eggs with all the trimmings, these guys were tempted to steal a car. They were not only dreaming of driving a car like that, they actually made their dream a reality." "I don't understand, Dan, but what does it mean for us? Are we supposed to call the local police and have them arrested?" "Somehow I don't think so, but we should look at the consequences that would befall us if we were to fall into temptation." "Yes. You mean like what Damien said about watching what we eat in order to save your heart from further hassles?" "Yes, something like that. Every bad temptation has a consequence. These guys will find themselves in prison sooner or later, and if we drank too much wine, we'll have a heck of a hangover. Or if we want too much in life, we'll end up with nothing more than a heartache." "Do you think it was happening to us before you had your accident?" Malou asked, realizing where Dan was going with his surmise. "Perhaps we were too much involved in getting to the top of the heap, without looking at the consequences of indulging in our temptations." "That's all fine and good, Dan, but what are we supposed to do now?" "Let's ask our cat, shall we?" Dan looked around, but once again they found themselves alone and at a loss to know what to do next. The two thieves were laughing their heads off as they drove away with Dan's car, and that until all of a sudden the engine stopped. The two young men looked at each other. "Don't tell me this guy forgot to fill it up," one of them told the other. "I don't think so, but the gas gauge shows the tank is full," the driver replied. "Let's see what's wrong," he suggested, literally jumping out of the car. As he landed, an older man grabbed him by the neck, immobilizing him. "I don't think you'll find anything by way of an explanation under the hood, Mitchell." He turned to the other guy, who had looked on the scene goggled-eyed. "As for you, Jeff, I should think your mother wouldn't be too proud of you right now. And don't try running away, because I don't think you'll be going very far." "Who are you?" Mitchell blurted between gasps for air when Damien released him. "How do you know our names?" "Let's just say I'm an old friend of the family, boys." He threw a glance in Jeff's direction. He was walking away backward slowly. "I thought I told you to stay put," Damien shouted. "I don't like disobedience." And with a snap of his fingers, he brought Jeff back to plunk him beside Mitchell. "What are you going to do with us?" Jeff inquired, as if in a daze, not understanding how he could be standing in front of the old man when a second ago he was making his way around the street corner. "No, you're going to appear in front of the man from whom you stole this car." "Why? Is he a judge or something?" Mitchell asked, a tentative smirk on his lips. "I'd wipe that grin off your face if I were you," Damien said. "And no, the man is not a judge per se, but he will be your judge in this instance." He then grabbed the two men, plopped them in their respective seats, and turned on the ignition with another snap of his fingers. "So I'll see you two at the restaurant in a minute, and don't try anything on the way, otherwise you'll find yourselves in jail by midfall, okay?" Still astonished by what had just occurred, the two fellows looked at each other and drove off. Coming out of the restaurant as if nothing had happened, Damien asked, "Did you enjoy your breakfast?" "Where were you?" Dan demanded, not at all pleased. "The car's been stolen, or was this another of your little stunts?" "No, don't get your knickers in a knot, Mr. Politano. Your car will be returned momentarily, and I suggest you take it easy on the culprits." Although taken aback by Damien formal tone, Dan stood up and glared at him. "What on earth does that mean?" "It means you'll have a chance to judge someone else for their trespass, and I wonder how you'll be faring, that's all." Dan didn't have time to reply when he, Malou, and Damien saw the Ferrari being returned exactly to the spot from which it had been taken. Mitchell and Jeff came out and advanced slowly toward Dan. "I'm very sorry, sir," Mitchell blurted, visibly worried. "But we just thought we would take your car for a ride, that's all." "Taking it for a ride, did you say? So not only are you and your friend thieves, but you're liars as well?" "We were going to bring it back," Jeff mumbled in turn, looking at his feet. "And I was supposed to believe that?" Dan demanded. "I'll tell you what I believe. You saw an opportunity to steal my car and took it. Whether you intended to bring it back, I frankly doubt it." He looked up at Damien. But we bought it back, didn't we?" Mitchell argued. "It's right there." He pointed to the car. "So what are you going to do with us?" Jeff asked, raising a worried gaze to Dan and Damien in turn. "Well, I don't think you deserve to have another opportunity like this one for a long time," Dan said. "So here's a little souvenir from me to you," instantly joining words to actions. "Oh no," Malou screamed. Dan threw a punch that landed on Mitchell's nose and another on Jeff's for good measure. Bleeding profusely from both their noses and holding their hands up to their faces, the two thieves groaned in pain. "What do you want from us?" Jeff asked then. "Only one thing. Get out of here and leave the thieving to others who can handle it," Dan suggested. "Today was only a warning. If you ever get tempted again, think of the consequences before you grab the next car, okay?" The both of them nodding and wiping their noses with their sleeves, they left the terrace of the restaurant in a run. Shaking his hand from the pain he suffered from throwing his fist in the thieves' faces, Dan turned to Damianos. "Is that the judgment you expected?" "I think you may have read one of Buddha's precepts," Damianos muttered, cracking a smile. "But what did it say?" "It goes something like this. Holding on to your anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You're the one who gets burned." "Well, I didn't get burned, but I'm sure out of practice," Dan replied, looking at Malou. "What did you do that for?" she demanded. "They said they were sorry." "Being sorry for your misdeed, my dear, is not enough these days. You often have to pay the consequences of your actions and suffer the punishment," Damianos replied, looking at Malou fixedly. "And I think it's time for you to leave before the restaurant gets too busy." Almost as if the car was driving itself toward their destination, Dan and Malou wondered what their next task would entail. They were driving along an avenue punctuated of tall palm trees and trimmed of elegant-looking buildings. People were walking along the sidewalk bordering the beach already, enjoying a pleasant morning stroll. What attracted Malou's attention first was the tranquility of the scene. People seemed to have been plucked out of a painting. "I wish you hadn't punched these two boys, Dan," she said, still brooding about what had happened at the restaurant. "What would you have me do?" "We couldn't call the police, and letting them go without punishment would have sent the wrong message. They would be out there right now, not only mocking us, but probably driving someone else's car." "I understand that, Dan, but you punching someone is not part of my dream or how I would see things in the future." "All right, I know what you're saying, hun, and you know me, I don't use my fists on anyone very often, now do I?" "No, I've never known you to do that, you're right." Malou paused and turned her gaze to her husband. "When you say you haven't used your fist very often, do you mean you've punched someone before?" Dan chuckled. "Yes, I have. When I was a kid I did, but my mum taught me to do otherwise when somebody offended me." "So why now? Are you going to return to punching people who disagree with you?" "No, Malou, I'm not, but in this instance I thought it would be better for these boys to learn their lesson from me rather than being dragged to prison by the end of the day." "Okay, you've made your point, but I just hope we don't find ourselves in the same situation in the future, that's all." "Same here, hun," Dan agreed. Changing the subject, Malou asked, "Do you have any idea where we are?" "Not a clue. It's probably somewhere in the south of France, as you said, but to tell you which city this is, I couldn't." "I think we're about to find out," Malou said, pointing to a couple waving at them. "You know, I wish I looked as good as Solange does when I'll be her age. Just look at her. She must have been a Hollywood actress." "Hello, you two," Solange interrupted her as Dan came to a stop by the curb. "How was breakfast?" "Let's not talk about it, please," Malou said, still a bit annoyed with Dan. "Oh, that bad, eh?" Damien remarked. "Well, why don't we sit on the beach over there," he pointed to it, "and see how you fared on this task, shall we?" "Good idea," Dan agreed, rounding the car to join Malou. Once seated on the beach, looking at the view over the Mediterranean, Solange turned to Dan. "So you scraped your knuckles handing down your sentence, did you?" Dan nodded. It was either that or seeing them go to jail. "I see. And you didn't see the latter as an option, did you?" "No, Solange. I didn't want them to end up in prison, and I thought my fist in their faces would be a reminder of what not to do in the future." "A normal reaction for the average man," Damien remarked, "but I think it would be a good idea for you to think of what you would have done if Stefano had stolen a car. Would you have punched him, or would you have driven him to the nearest police station, given the choice?" "That's different," Dan retorted. "Is it?" "Yes, it is, Damien. My kids wouldn't steal a car. We would have taught them otherwise." "Ah, yes. All parents think they've done the best they could with their children's education, but they also, and very often, forget the peer pressure and the opportunities that present themselves to them." "But if we teach them to earn everything they need or want, wouldn't they be able to resist these sorts of temptations?" Malou asked, getting slightly annoyed. Neither she nor Dan wanted their education of the children to be put into question. Solange ventured a smile. "Listen to me, Malou. Circumstances are often beyond anyone's control, but you and Dan need to be conscious of the possibilities that may arise, and I also think that you need to examine What you would do if you found out that one of your children was in trouble. I don't think I would punch Stefano if he ever stole anything, Dan said in response to Damien's earlier question. But I don't think I'll drive him to the police station either. What would you do then? Damien asked. I would sit him down, talk sense into him, and let him consider the consequences that would certainly await him if he did it again. Dan stopped and put his elbows on his knees while raising his eyes to the ocean before him. I can't even imagine him doing such a thing, but if he ever did, I'd make him see the insanity of such an act. Stealing someone else's possession is like stealing a part of one's past, present and future. I would do everything in my power for my son to understand where such an act could lead him. I think that's the best answer I've heard in a long time, Damien said with a sigh of relief. Have you ever encountered parents who would do otherwise? Dan asked. Oh yes, my dear. A few would have beaten their kid senseless. Another few would have taken the child to jail without the chance of a trial, and some others would have grounded the kid until he came to his senses. But only 1 or 2 of the parents we've guided along the way to making their dream a reality have actually realized the impact their demonstrative words and examples could have on their children.